Well, that's a really good question, Sanjay, because for the last couple of decades, the digital entrepreneurs have been saying, keep government out of my business. And all of a sudden, you have very thoughtful people like Sam Altman and like Brad Smith at Microsoft saying, hey, we got to do something. I think my favorite quote is Sundar Pichai, who said, AI is too important not to regulate and too important not to regulate well.
Welcome to the Regulating AI podcast. Join host Sanjay Puri as he explores the dynamic and developing world of artificial intelligence governance. Each episode features deep dives with global leaders at the forefront of regulating AI responsibly, tackling the challenges using AI can bring about head-on and enabling balance without hindering innovation.
Welcome to the Regulating AI podcast. Artificial intelligence, AI, stands at the forefront of technological revolution. So how do we regulate it without stifling innovation? Our podcast features insights from various perspectives. We've had industry leaders to government officials to leaders of advocacy groups. Together, they address pivotal questions that are needed to create fair and practical legislation. Today, we have a very special guest with us today, Tom Wheeler, who was the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission from 2013 to 2017. He's currently a visiting fellow in governance studies at Brookings Institution and has been involved with new telecommunications networks and services for over 4 decades. Recently, Tom wrote a very thought-provoking piece on AI regulation, which we'll be discussing today. He also has a very interesting book called Techlash: Who Makes the Rules in the Digital Gilded Age, which I'm hoping to discuss with him in another podcast. Tom, welcome to the show.
Hello, Sanjay. It's nice to be with you.
Great. Tom, our audience is global. We have members of Congress, Senate, their staff, industry leaders, and policymakers, but also people who are, startups in the AI industry around the world. So your recent piece on Brookings highlighted some key players in the AI industry calling for regulation. What do you think prompted their shift in stance in terms of calling for this regulation, Tom?
Well, that's a really good question, Sanjay, because for the last couple of decades, the digital entrepreneurs have been saying, keep government out of my business, keep government out of my business. And all of a sudden, you have very thoughtful people like Sam Altman and like Brad Smith at Microsoft saying, hey, we got to do something. I think my favorite quote is Sundar Pichai, who said, AI is too important not to regulate and too important not to regulate well. And so the question becomes, why did they make that change? And I think there's only one answer, which is self-interest. I mean, and I don't mean that in a negative kind of way. We all act in our self-interest. It's just that self-interest is now being redefined. I mean, I think one point is that it has somewhat of a calming effect on all the frenzy of the impending apocalypse, if you will. Saying, hey, relax, we can take care of this. We can figure out how to have some kind of oversight. And I think the other aspect of it is that it begins to define the policy debate, so that instead of, I'll meet you at the front gate with my shotgun, it's come on in. I recognize we need to do something. Let's talk about how that's done. And they get to define the opening rounds of that discussion. So, I think, and I was, a long time practitioner, if you will, of representing companies before the federal agencies and the Congress. And I think it's a very smart strategy on their part.
So smart strategy, as you said, instead of going in with a shotgun, they're going in the friendly way. A lot of cynics and guests on our show have said this is a strategy of regulatory capture, so that what happens is, let's say the new people who don't have the tremendous resources are going to find that ladder harder and harder, who don't have an army of lawyers or experts. Do you think that there could be some element of that?
So, I always chuckle. I'm not sure that's the right word. I always, when I hear the term regulatory capture, I kind of shrug. Because the ultimate regulatory capture is to do nothing, right?
Yeah.
And so I understand the concept of regulatory capture. I understand, and I hope we'll have a chance to talk about it. It's one of my concerns about the licensing idea. But the fact of the matter is that, there might be regulatory capture is not a reason not to have regulation. And you need to deal with it, but you shouldn't run away with regulation. Against regulation just because, there may be some influence that the regulated have on the regulator.
So maybe it is there, but we still need to do something. Coming to a point you just touched on, you mentioned licensing AI, which was originally proposed, or it was proposed by Sam Altman in that original session that you talked about, the CEO of OpenAI, is not the answer according to you. But you said it in your paper, it contains the answers.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate for our listeners? What do you mean by that?
Sure. So when I was chairman of the FCC, I was responsible for the federal government's largest licensing program. The federal government has all kinds of licensing program. They license grazing rights. They license drilling rights. And I and my colleagues at the FCC oversaw the licensing of the airwaves of spectrum. And it was a terribly important thing, because if you have a free-for-all out there and anybody can go out and broadcast and do whatever they want without any concern for other users, then you get nothing, because everybody interferes with everybody else. So the federal government says we will start licensing spectrum and deciding this is who will be this television station in this town. This is who will be the radio stations. These are who will get to use it for wireless telephony or for wireless communications, etc. And what I learned from that experience is that licensing is inherently anti-competitive, and as a result, inherently anti-innovative. And that what you're doing is you are giving a government grant, if not monopoly, at least of one of a handful of users, and saying, you're the only ones who can use that asset, who can behave this way. And that is an incredibly potent kind of grant. And what it ends up leading to is it leads to great economic power, which leads to great political power, which brings us back to the topic you were just discussing, and that is that political power gets used ultimately to what can I do to lessen the requirements on the license, and so that's one set of problems. It's also a very blunt instrument. You can't get specific about behaviors inside a license. Basic things when it came to spectrum, basic things like, okay, what are we going to do about closed captioning for those who are hard of hearing? What are we going to do to make sure that the antennas that go up aren't interfering with airplanes and things like this? There have to be specific policies that follow along with the licensing. So what I said in this Brookings piece that you referenced is that licensing is not the approach to take, but there are a couple of components that you have to address in licensing that are good ideas, such as you got to figure out what the responsibilities of a licensee are, and you got to enforce them. And so what we need to be thinking about is what's the best way in which we can establish technical standards, behavioral standards, and enforce them for AI.
So you're saying there are certain standards that need to be implemented. As you said, there are some things in the licensing that has value, and you draw some parallels to spectrum licensing. But Tom, you also talk about how the proliferation of open source AI models, which, Meta has Llama, Mistral, now Gemini has done that, and now recently Elon said he's going to open source Grok. You say, how does a proliferation of open source AI models complicate the idea of licensing AI?
Well, open source sure does address the competition issue that I was worried about, and sure does address the innovation issue. The difficulty is that how do you end up licensing, overseeing two guys and a dog in a garage in Estonia? And so open source has some great benefits to it. But the difficulty is, how do you get your arms around the establishment of any expectations for that? And again, I think that the idea of starting with big AI, if you will, and establishing technical standards, red teams, audits, transparency, et cetera, is a good idea. I don't think you need licensing to do that, but it's a good idea. And because of the fact that the open source are essentially derivative of those big activities, there's a trickle down effect, if you will, into open source, and that's beneficial. But my approach or my suggestion is that one of the problems when we talk about AI and regulating AI is that it is too massive a concept. So AI is like the mythical Greek Hydra monster, right? That had all these multiple heads. I mean, it can manifest itself in multiple ways. And each of those heads, by the way, ends up being like the Roman god with two faces. And so that's a both positive and negative potential. And so what we need to be doing is we need to be parsing out our consideration of AI. Okay, let's break it into what are we going to do about technical expectations? And then what are we going to do about behavioral expectations? I wrote a book before Techlash. Thank you very much for mentioning Techlash. I wrote a book before Techlash called From Gutenberg to Google, The History of Our Future, which, if we're going to continue my commercials here, comes out in June in paperback with a special addendum on AI. But one of the takeaways from Gutenberg to Google was that it is never the primary technology that is transformational, but always the secondary effects.
Mhm.
And so as we parse out our consideration of how to deal with AI, yes, we need technical standards, but then we need to look at the effects of the technology and begin to develop behavioral standards for that.
Tom, when you say behavior, and you mentioned this a couple of times, what do you specifically mean by behavioral standards for our audience?
Well, let's take a couple of examples.
Mhm.
And I think, again, you have to parse the concept of behavioral standards.
Mhm.
The low-hanging fruit here is things which society has decided are bad in an analog environment, which are made more bad. I was an English major. Things that are made worse by AI or exacerbated by AI. We know that fraud is illegal.
Right.
It doesn't matter whether the fraud was perpetrated by analog means or by digital means or enhanced by AI. It's illegal. The same with discrimination and other kinds of well-established practices. You know, Lena Khan, the great chairwoman of the Federal Trade Commission, had a great explanation of this. She said that there is no AI exemption in existing law.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and so the first effect that we deal with is, okay, what are those that we can deal with existing laws?
Hmm.
The second bucket, if you will, is more difficult, and it deals with the fact that for the last 20 years, we've been sweeping under the policy rug all of the issues brought about by the digital revolution. Privacy, what competition in a digital market is, truth and trust, and these kinds of things. And it's time that we step up and deal with those, because again, AI only exacerbates those challenges. And the fact that for 20 years we have ignored those challenges puts us on the back foot, if you will, when it comes to dealing with their AI manifestations. So if that's the second bucket, the third bucket then is the unknown unknowns. We know, you know, Sanjay, you and I can sit here and look at each other and say, we know that AI is going to develop and deliver some incredible new things that we haven't even imagined.
Mm-hmm.
And how are we going to deal with those? How do we create an oversight structure that is agile enough to deal with what may be coming down the line? And I'll tell you, you know, as the former head of a federal regulatory agency, agility is not the word that you use to describe those situations. So we need to bring a new way of thinking into this new challenge. And I think that that's the way we put our arms around the effects of AI by, again, parsing them into their various components.
So, Tom, you said several things that I want to follow up on. Very, very interesting things. So I'll start with the last one and I'll work my way up. You said agility. Tom and I both live in Washington, so agility is the thing that never happens in this town. Now, as you said, AI is like the Greek god Hydra. It keeps evolving. You know, every day there's something new. We have members of Congress who are now tasked members of Congress and Senate who are tasked with coming up with some legislation. We have an executive order, but some kind of legislation needs to happen now. Obviously, nothing's big is going to happen in this year, but how do, and you are in a regulatory agency, how do members of Congress create legislation for something that's evolving so very fast? And I've asked this to members of Congress, and they say it'll be an evolution, it's a challenge, all kinds of other stuff. I've had senators come here and I've asked the same question. You sat on the other side, as you said. Any thoughts? That's my first question, and then I'll come to others.
Sure. We have a representative government.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to walk out on the street and ask the first 6 people that you saw what they thought about large language models and the oversight of it, you'd get a lot of stares back at you. You know, it's significant, I think, that when the House of Representatives in the last couple of weeks went to put together a task force, a bipartisan task force on AI policy, that it totaled 25, 30 members. It totaled, it was 5% of the members of the House of Representatives who had a working knowledge of the issue. And that leads us, and I don't say that to fault them. I was with a member of the Senate yesterday who at noon was talking about the effect of loneliness on some of the challenges that we face nationally, and at dinner was talking about Gaza and the EU Ireland problems with the border in Northern Ireland. I mean, the job of a representative or a senator is mind-boggling in terms of the breadth on which you are expected to become knowledgeable. And that puts us in a situation where we take 21st century challenges and define them in 20th century terms and propose 19th century solutions. That we always define tomorrow in terms of what we understand today. That's just human nature. So one of the challenges of meaningful oversight for AI is the establishment of a functional structure inside the federal government where there is ongoing expertise, where the officials there wake up in the morning and look themselves in the mirror and say, what am I going to do today about this issue? And are able to get quite specific about it. And but again, I have all the respect in the world for these elected representatives and the challenges they face, but it's important to be able to say that we look to somebody with some expertise to help.
So just to follow up, because that was one of the questions I had, and then I have a few others to go back to your earlier comments. You said one of the things you propose is either, and I don't know if that's the exact term, a separate regulatory body, right, or in your paper, etc. Now, I've asked this to several members of Congress on our show, Bipartisan. They say not happening because for a variety of reasons, we live in a very partisan area. That's number one. And it'll add to bureaucracy. Some say we already have agencies like the FCC, the FTC, we have DOJ, etc. And I know this is something that you have proposed and several others have proposed. What do you have to say to some of our guests who say it's going to be tough to create an agency, especially a new bureaucracy for something like this? And some of them will be listening to you right now, by the way.
Sure. Well, let's start with the basics. That I've got nothing but the highest respect for these civil servants and the job that they are doing. The difficulty is that they're doing it based on statutes and structures and judicial decisions that are based in the industrial era. Okay, so the Federal Trade Commission, as I said before, Lena Khan is doing a great job as chair of the Federal Trade Commission. Federal Trade Commission was created in 1914. And that's when its basic operational statute came into being. Sure, it was modified along the way, but it was modified in terms of industrial concepts. The Federal Communications Commission that I used to chair, its statute was created in 1934. Television broadcasting didn't even exist then. The Department of Justice, just to mention the three that you mentioned, the Department of Justice is working on an antitrust statute that was written in 1890 and another one in 1914. And the problem is that the challenge faced today in the digital era is different from that ever could have been imagined in the industrial era, and that therefore an agency is constrained in what it can do. There is a huge push, particularly amongst Republicans, to keep agencies from discretionary decision-making. There will be a big Supreme Court case in a couple of months on a concept called Chevron deference, which is basically, it's an 1986 Supreme Court case that in essence says, we have expert agencies for a reason, let's let them use their expertise. And the Republicans are saying that's the shadow government that we need to shut down. So I, like I say, I've got huge respect for these people, and I've got huge respect for how they're trying to shoehorn digital challenges into industrial era statutes and structures. Now, insofar as do we have a Congress that would pass such legislation? Well, we don't have a Congress that can pass a budget. And we kind of start there. However, this concept for an expert digital agency has been introduced in the Congress. Yeah. Senator Michael Bennet of Colorado and Senator Peter Welch of Vermont have both introduced it into that body. Lindsey Graham and Elizabeth Warren, speaking of odd bedfellows, have a similar concept. And the four of those senators in a bipartisan group recently went to Leader Schumer and saying, hey, we need to do something about this. Let's open up the dialogue on how we get this done. I am a political pragmatist, but that also doesn't mean that you don't say, let's make sure that we get the ideas out there and we have a fulsome debate about them.
And you got your ideas and our listeners are listening. Tom, I want to clarify something which on open source that you discussed. Are you for open source or are you not? Because you want innovation and maybe less monopoly, but obviously there are challenges. So would you say open source, because there are two camps right now, as you know, open source, closed source. Where do you come out on that?
I'm pro open source as a source of competition and innovation that also needs to have guardrails in place to oversee its behavior and its effects. Okay.
So open source with guardrails. One final question. EU AI Act just went through Parliament, I think yesterday, etc. They have taken and you talked about our privacy laws and other stuff. They've taken a lead, as you know, in the issue of privacy. Now they're doing something with, the big markets, etc. American companies who are doing business in EU will have to comply. Are there lessons to be learned from them by us, Tom?
Oh, yes. So Sanjay, one of the tragedies, I mean, I'm a guy who loves history.
Mhm.
And one of the tragedies of the last couple of decades in the digital era is the United States has abrogated its leadership responsibility in developing policy as technologies evolve. I mean, never before in the history of this nation have we failed to develop a policy in response to a new technology. I mean, pick your poison. Go back and think through through history. But that's what we've done for the last 20 years. And that has let foreign governments fill the void and make the rules. It's also allowed state governments to come in and fill the void and make the rules, both of which have big problems. So if you've got state A and state B, and they have slightly different nuances in the laws that they pass because Congress hasn't done something, then you balkanize the marketplace, the domestic marketplace. If you look at the situation in the EU, where they've had incredible leadership on digital platforms, and now, as you point out just yesterday, on AI. In an interconnected world where the companies need to enjoy the scale economies that come from a common network delivering common products and collecting common information, there's a forcing function that says, okay, we've got to level things out so that the rule that was created over there in Europe ends up applying here. The classic example of that is the GDPR, the privacy rule that Europe put in place years ago, that has its faults, but they did something. And when the state of California, and I think 16 other states, decided they wanted to pass their privacy law, they based it on GDPR. And when China, of all places, decided they wanted to pass a privacy law, they based it on GDPR, although with more power to the state. But the fact of the matter remains that I think that American companies are going to end up being in a situation where the rules under which they operate, if they want to enjoy the scope and scale economies, the network effects that come from the internet, that they're going to have to end up obeying rules established by other nations that prioritize those countries' needs rather than the United States and how we might have our priorities. And that's probably another reason, to go back to your first question, another reason why the AI leadership is saying, well, we need to have our own rules over here. It is just, tragic is a big word, but the way in which American policymakers, for the first time in history, have walked away from their responsibility to oversee a new technology and left it to others to decide is tragic.
You make a very interesting point, because even though, we have entrepreneurs who come in and say, hey, US innovates, Europe regulates, but
Right.
they also say we want consistency, because how can they plan a business where, as you said, there's even within states, there's a patchwork of rules and regulations, Tom. Tom, you mentioned the concept of pirate AI in your piece. Can you explain to our listeners what that is and why it's a concern to you?
Well, I was trying to draw the analogy back to the FCC regulating spectrum and what we call pirate radio, which is, opening up a radio station is not hard. I remember when I was chairman, we shut down a station that was nothing more than basic broadcast components that you can get off the shelf, hooked up to a laptop that was broadcasting, that was delivering the content, and was located in a tenement attic in Brooklyn. And we shut it down because of the fact that it was interfering with other stations, licensed stations. One of the things about open source is we don't want to create an environment of pirate AI where, hey, the code to build an open source model is out there and readily available. We need to have standards. We need to have expectations. We need to have guardrails, both in the application of the technology and its effects.
So we need to have guardrails. Tom, you also highlighted the importance of a multi-stakeholder process in developing industry standards. How can we make sure that those processes also address the societal effects of AI, not just technical considerations?
Well, that's a great question, Sanjay. And let me go back a little bit. This is one of the things I talk about in TechLash.
Mm-hmm.
When it came to regulate the abuses of the industrial era, the Congress cloned the management techniques of the companies that they were going to regulate. And what were those management techniques? Well, they were there. You had a guy on the floor, the shop floor. He was a guy at that point in time, over and following a rule book, and he was overseen by supervisors to make sure that he was following a rule book, and they were overseen by managers. And we're surprised that we end up with a rules-based bureaucracy that is sclerotic and micromanaging. We shouldn't be. I contrasted that with how digital management is done, and particular digital technical management, where standards are set by a multi-stakeholder process that everybody adheres to. How did we get from 1G to 2G to 3G to 4G to 5G and now 6G for wireless phones? It was a multi-stakeholder process where everybody was participating, and where, as witnessed by that evolution from 1G to 6G, there was agility as technology and the marketplace changed. How do we bring that kind of agility into government? And so my concept is that we do the same thing that we did in the late 19th and early 20th century. And that is, we clone the techniques, the management techniques that have brought us to this point, and apply them in a new governmental procedural approach.
So clone their techniques. Tom, you have experience in both the private sector and the government. What lessons do you think we can draw from the regulation of other emerging technologies that could, inform our approach to AI regulation?
Well, I don't know if this is emerging technology, but I'm struck right now by what we see in the headlines every day about Boeing and the standards for aircraft. Okay, I will put $1 on the table right now, Sanjay, and bet you that there aren't a half a dozen members of Congress who can explain jet propulsion or Bernoulli's principle, which is what keeps an airplane in the air. Yet we have detailed expectations of how you make that experience safe. and we oversee those expectations, and we have consequences for when they aren't met.
Mhm.
We got to be able to do the same thing for AI, it seems to me.
So something like an FAA or something like that, is that what you're saying? Some people have suggested like we do for nuclear weapons, etc.
Yeah, sure.
It's something like that is what you're saying. Tom, what are some of the key challenges and opportunities you see to create a fair and equitable regulatory framework for AI?
Well, I think first we've got to start down the process. We need to start having the debate. It is terrific that Sam Altman and Brad Smith and others put an ante on the table, if you will, right? And said, this is where the discussion begins. Now we need to get into the details. And as I said before, that doesn't mean that you grab the whole issue in one armful. But first you got to decide, how am I going to parse it into its components that are bite-sized and chewable, if you will.
Yeah.
And then start down the path of having the debate about what constitutes good policy for each of those components. And the frustration is that we have had N+1 hearings. God bless Joe Biden and his executive order. I mean, I watched the difficulty pulling that together across diverse federal agencies. And even then, it only had a couple of mandatory requirements for LLMs insofar as the application of the Defense Production Act and requiring red teams and transparency and reporting and things like this, because that authority doesn't exist even in the presidency, even amidst all of the agencies of the federal government. And when the president issued the executive order, he said, Congress needs to act. There isn't enough authority to deal with these issues. We need to start the discussion and get specific about, okay, how do we deal with the technical issues? How do we deal with the behavioral effects issues? And let's get that debate going on.
So let's get that debate going on. Tom, you were with the FCC. There was a big issue about getting broadband into rural and other areas. It's still continuing on, which boggles my mind because I've been listening. Are there concerns, would you have that we could have an AI divide where, whether it's rural or other parts of our country, you look at educational institutions, I see, and we've had people from some of the top universities and others come in, but we have community colleges. 40% of our students get their education there. We have rural healthcare systems, which are going to be engaging in AI. You are dealing with this whole access, or FCC was maybe dealing with the access to broadband and things in some of these areas. How do we make sure there is an equity in AI, Tom?
So let me tell you a story. So we ran a program that was called the Universal Service Fund, in which we gave out about $4 billion a year to subsidize broadband in unserved areas, which was entirely inefficient, ineffective. And we proposed a change, which is that we need to pay for broadband like we pay for roads, which is once, which is actually what was in the Infrastructure Act and is now being implemented by the Biden administration. But one day I went to Eastern Kentucky, to a town that had been devastated by the coal industry collapse.
Hmm.
And this excited my historical leanings, because it was the railroad that enabled the coal industry to exist in the first place, because the railroad hauled the coal out of these hollers, they call them, not a hollow, a holler that they call them down there. And then all of a sudden the coal industry died. And you know what's happening now? Fiber optic is the new network. And I had the most incredible experience of being at a community college, as you suggest, where there had now been high-speed fiber connections to the internet. And I met some coal miners who I'd shake their hand, and they had these huge hands that would just engulf my hand. I'd shake their hand, and they're learning to code. And they were coding for Apple, and they were coding for Microsoft, because of the fact that they had access to the market the same way that the coal miners had access to the market by the railroad. It is essential that we connect all of America, but it's not, I mean, there's probably $60 billion total that's now being spent to make sure that America is connected with broadband. The purpose of that is not so that Aunt Minnie, sitting in her farmhouse, can watch Netflix. That's a wonderful thing. But the real need is to make sure that the warehouse down the street from Aunt Minnie, or the community college, or the hospital, or the bank, and in a world where everything is done in the cloud, it is how do all of those institutions get access to the cloud on an equal basis? And AI becomes a component of that. And then one last observation. As you know, while I was chairman, we passed the net neutrality rules that provided for open and non-discriminatory access on reasonable terms to the last mile of the internet. And the FCC is about, the Trump FCC killed those, and the Biden FCC is about to revisit them next month. And one of the important things about an open internet is AI. Because we can't have someone, in terms of the person, the company, that controls the last mile of the network, suddenly determine, well, here's how AI is going to work, or here's how it's not going to work, or here's what you're going to get, or here's what you're not going to get. And when you stop and think about it, AI has been able to succeed because the internet is a network of networks in which packets can sort their way around to make sure they get delivered in the most efficient manner until you get to the last mile, and the mile to your house and my house. And we need to make sure that that openness that has allowed for the establishment of large language models and the access to those large language models remains open, safe, and secure. And that's why an open internet and net neutrality is important to AI. We have always, it's been interesting. The open internet has been going on, there's been an argument going on for 20 years, literally 20 years. And it moved from video, where Comcast was blocking video because it was competitive to their cable service, to when I dealt with the issue, it was about access to websites and apps. And now it's about access to AI. And we need a fast, fair, and open internet to do that.
Fast, fair, and open internet, Tom. Those are great points for AI equity for all. Tom, final comments for our audience. I told you, global audience who are listening to you, it'll go across, what would be your final comments to our audience?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Sanjay, for the invitation and for this interesting discussion. I'm just anxious. I know I've got ideas, but I know that I don't have all the answers, but we need to have a discussion about that. And we need to avoid retreating into our own corners and lobbing our talking points at each other from across the ring, and get out there and, okay, let's talk about how we're going to accomplish those goals. Let's understand that here's the downside of this, here's the upside of this, and let's be willing to make compromises, because nothing's perfect. You know, one of the things that I learned when I was chairman is that the public interest is very much a fungible commodity, and everybody would come into your office and say, "Oh, if you look at what I want this way, it's very much in the public interest." And somebody else would come in and say, "Oh, well, if you look at it this way, which happens to be what I want, it's in the public interest." We need to have the tension between those kinds of forces that will determine not who winners and losers are, but how we protect the public interest.
So talk to each other, not retreat in a corner, and have that discussion. Thank you, Tom, for sharing your insights and expertise on this very critical topic of AI regulation. Your perspective as a former FCC chairman and your deep understanding of the telecommunication industry have shed a real light on the complexities and nuances in regulating this very rapidly evolving field. Really, really appreciate this. Thank you for joining us, and I'm sure our listeners have gained invaluable insights from this conversation. Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you, Sanjay.
Thank you.